are the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa Arts Council, Sheraton Iowa City, the Iowa City Public Library, the Iowa City Coralville Convention and Visitors Bureau, Bradley and Riley PC, and Knudsen Construction. So on to the important stuff. I'll introduce our four authors for this session. We have Gregory Galloway, Larry Watson, Susanna Daniel, and Lili Mendoza. Gregory Galloway is a native of Southeast Iowa and is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. His first novel was titled As Simple as Snow, and his new novel is titled The 39 Deaths of Adam Strand. Susanna Daniel is a graduate of Columbia University and the University of Iowa Writers Workshop. Her second and latest novel is Sea Creatures. Larry Watson is the author of the novels In a Dark Time, Montana 1948, White Crosses, Laura Orchard, and Sundown Yellow Moon. His latest is Let Him Go. And Lili Mendoza is a fiction writer, poet, and translator from Panama, and her stories and poetry have been anthologized in Panama, Costa Rica, Spain, Peru, and the U.S.
Great. Thank you all for coming out to see us, and thank you, Lili and Susanna and Larry, for joining us on the panel, Sense of Place. One of the things that struck me particularly about these people, and maybe in general, is that we tend to write about places that we've been and not places that we are. And what that suggests is that there's a temporal component to place. And I thought that Larry would be great to start this off, since he has written a book that has both place and time in the title, Montana 1948, and his current novel also takes place in 1951. So Larry, can you talk about sort of the intersection of time and place as you think about your writing?
Sure, I'll be happy to. Well, of course, we're talking about setting, and I think frequently when we talk about setting in fiction writing classes, or literature classes for that matter, we often talk about the place, but forget that stories are set not only in places, but in time. For me, I have mostly been setting my fictions in sort of mid-20th century, although I've creeped up into the 60s and back into the 30s and 40s in a couple of fictions. And I've also been writing about a place that's sort of my regional heritage, the upper Midwest, and I don't write Westerns, I don't write Midwestern literature. I sort of think of myself as writing Northers. And I write about places where I have been, places that I have left, and I think this probably has something to do with both place and time, because I write much more from memory than from observation. So if I were writing a story in 2013, I would rely on powers of observation. I would go out there and look at the world and try to notice things. And of course, there would be so much data, I would feel overwhelmed. However, if I use memory, I sort of trust memory to have done some selection for me. And so the things that stick in that memory filter, I think of as the important details for fictions, even if I don't necessarily know how or why they're important. I feel as though that's the material that I need to work with.
And Susanna, I know that you've written about Miami, and I know that based upon some of your other talks that there are people from your past that are in those novels in some form or other. So can you talk about sort of how time and place sort of affects your writing?
Sure, yeah, I think that's so true what Larry said about like memory being a better curator of setting than observation is, which is so true of me. So I was born and raised in South Florida, and my good friend was just asking me, like, how many more South Florida novels are you going to write? And I was like, I think I have another few in me. I'm just going to stick with it. And both of my novels end in the early 90s, which is coincidentally when I left South Florida, and I live in the Midwest, and I've lived there for 14 years, 12 to 14 years. But the thing about setting, I mean, both of my novels and everybody else's here, they're very setting rich, right? They're really, that the setting is developed as sort of a character on the page, including the era in which they're placed. And the thing about setting that I always have to remind myself, and I remind students when I'm given the chance, is that it's so much more meaningful on the page than it is in real life, and it sort of worms its way into dialogue, into scene, into action in a way that should imbue more meaning onto, the characters and the plot than just laying there on the page, which is, like I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and I like Madison, but it doesn't bring all that much meaning to my daily life in the way that South Florida brings meaning to the lives of my characters, if that makes sense.
And I know you've talked about that, I don't know if goal is overstating it, but that at some point you would like to write something based in the Midwest.
I
And
would. But again, it's like you need that sort of curatorial eye, which I don't have on the Midwest yet. I'm still sort of like an ethnographer. I'm kind of like, well, what angle would I take? Would I be, somebody who's lived in the Midwest for 12 years and is like raising two little Midwestern boys? I mean, is that who I would be on the page? And it's a little too close. Earlier, I was talking about in my second book, I returned to Stiltsville, which is where my first book is. My first book is called Stiltsville. It's where my first book takes place, and I wrote about a person named the Hermit, who was a guy who lived out at Stiltsville, which is a collection of houses in the bay off of downtown Miami, and he didn't have a boat. Like he had runners come and bring him drugs and women, and my parents used to like spy on him with binoculars at the kitchen window because he was like a hippie and he was always naked, and so were the women. And I was, I was a kid, and I didn't think much about the Hermit until in 1992, Hurricane Andrew wiped out the stilt houses, and I was like, where'd that guy go? And I wanted to write about him, but I felt kind of locked into this sort of hippie guy who probably wouldn't really be a powerful character on the page, no offense to the guy, until, and I was saying this earlier, that I was reading in Miami, and this woman came up, and she kind of handed me these Polaroids, and they were a much younger version of herself in a bikini with like this handsome, swarthy, like half-nude guy, and she's like, I used to hang out at Stiltsville and party with Robert, what's-his-face, and I was like, that's the Hermit. My parents used to spy on him. Like, he was our neighbor. And I was like, what happened to him? And like apparently he's living in a hut in Laos or something. So as true to hermit nature, he has continued. So I felt at that point like I could put him in the past, and like my hermit on the page in Sea Creatures has nothing to do with that hermit whatsoever.
But there is sort of a, I guess, inside-outside component to both of your writings, that the experiences as an insider, but then when you approach it from the writer's perspective, it's from an outsider perspective. And is that true for you as well?
Well, I write about a place that is and isn't. I write, my stories are all set basically in Panama, but there are two Panamas, the one I inhabit and the one that inhabits me. And that one, the second one, I carry wherever I go. So basically the stories that can spring from, for example, Iowa, while I'm here and my other travels, will always be filtered by that prism of the Panamanian paradigm. So one thing is to go to a place and get the map, the Polaroids, you have the sense of scenery. You can capture that. We all have eyes and we can decode it quite well. But it's the perception of Panamanians, how we see the world and how we see our very own reality that I like to capture and bring to my stories. So I don't want to think that this is diaspora, because I haven't left Panama. I'm going back to it. I'm going back to her. She's so feminine. The stories basically take place wherever I want to bring them up, but I cannot write as anything else. But I can't talk about Panama without, I mix identity and place. Panama is an ever-changing nation. We are under our territory changes physically. We change every day. Right now, we're having the expansion of the canal, which is a major project. We have a Trump Tower. We're changing the scenery as it is. It rumbles. The entire city is just a loud noise. What else are we having? Oh, we have foreign investors. Everybody wants a little piece of Panama these days. So the landscape that I used to know is changing right in front of my eyes. And the emotional landscape is changing as well. That is the only setting that I would give my stories, and they happen from anywhere from Chorrillo, which is the tenement, the ghetto I live in, really tough part of town, really lovely part of town too, to Caledonia, any part of Panama. We have so many works of fiction set in Panama, and it's always seen with this tint of Havana 50-something, those rose-colored glasses of the desire to create, to have this pin-up-y girls with the big flowers in their head. That is a cartoon. That's not Panama. And the girls, like that, like with the wavy hair and the big, that's gone. They don't make them like that anymore. Yeah, they're long now. Genetics change them, diets change them. So now you have this long-legged, tall Panameñas where did you come from? Am I the last one of them? Apparently. So all the literature that comes, that is inspired by Panama, and we have Carré, John Le Carré también tiene, he has, everybody writes about Panama. Everybody goes to Panama. Everybody stays in Panama. But nothing that's portrayed right now is authentic. And it's missing the realities of our landscape, which is urban. It can be violent. It's, relax and chill. So perhaps I didn't pick the right panel, a sense of place, because it's the emotional landscape and how the outside affects it that I am really interested in. The buildings are going to come and go, the palm trees, the beautiful water, it's all there. But it's how we're reacting to our own beauty that it's what I try to portray as briefly as I can in a coloring book.
And can you talk a little bit, you mentioned authenticity, and can you talk about the importance of authenticity in the writing as opposed to or connected to accuracy? So to your point, do you want to depict Panama in an authentic way and accurately so that streets are accurate, that sort of thing, or you're more interested in authenticity?
Yeah, the authenticity of it all is it's relative. I mean, I don't care. We had Tom Clancy who passed away a few weeks ago. Tom Clancy loved Panama. He wrote a lot about us. He usually got it right too. Check. But I don't see him walking down the streets of Chorrillo or Caledonia and finding his way. He always had that sense of being outside. But did he get it right? Yes, he did. The names of the streets and everything. But it's like a map. I don't know Iowa. You send me out here, I'll get lost. But I remember, the landmarks and everything, and the sense and flavor of the people that he never really got. Clancy Carré doesn't get it. They think it's Banana Republic. Yes, it is Banana Republic, but there's something beyond it. That authenticity is what I'm looking for. And again, it's subjective. It's very relative. That's that.
Would you guys like to talk about, in your work, Larry, sort of accuracy at all, authenticity? I know you strive for, but is accuracy important?
Yeah, it is important. Maybe I'd make you mentioned the objectivity, so maybe I might make a distinction that accuracy does have to do with objectivity and fact, and perhaps authenticity is fact connected to emotion. And so I would want the details that are accurate, true to the place, but I would also want the details that are accurate and true to the place that have some sort of emotional aura surrounding them. Those are the details that I most want, and I sort of trust some kind of writerly instinct to go toward those details. I'm not particularly aware of choosing this detail and discarding this detail. I'm sort of trusting that I'll feel something for a particular detail or fact and use it in my fiction.
And Susanna, do you want to talk about that at all?
Actually, I was just thinking about Bob Stone's great story, Under the Pitons, which I taught recently in my workshop, and so it's like it's a really fun story if you haven't read it. It's just a romp. It's this sort of mini epic with a tragic hero, and they're drug running people. They're drunk the whole time, and they well, I won't tell you what happens, but they're trying to offload all these drugs, and the main character, Blessington, wants to open a restaurant in the Keys. That's his pipe dream, which from the beginning isn't going to work out because he's making some really questionable choices. But the Pitons are there the whole time, these two peaks in St. Lucia, and these guys are moored on a boat just off of St. Lucia. And the way that Robert Stone inserts the Pitons into the story is so well crafted, and yet it's completely you don't even see it when you're reading. You don't feel the puppetry of it. But I mean, they become these. I mean, so it's physically resonant. You can really see the Pitons as they separate from each other in the dusk, and they sort of, their shadows come out over the water as if they're sort of coming to get these characters. And so there's physically resonant, and there's thematically resonant throughout the whole story, and characterologically resonant. I mean, it's working so hard. And when you actually look at this at the Pitons mentioned on the page, they're only mentioned like 5 times. I mean, I think that's what setting can do. That if you have, if you're Robert Stone, I guess, so you can really just imbue the story with such a light touch, but imbue it with so much of those different layers of meaning.
For my first novel, As Simple as Snow, the fictional town is a mashup of 3 small towns, one being Keokuk, Iowa, another one being a small town in Connecticut, and another one being a small town in Illinois. And I actually created a map that took parts of those 3 cities to create this fictional town. And I remember that the first response I got from a friend of mine was, Twixt and Town Street doesn't intersect. And I kept saying, well, maybe not in your town it doesn't, but in this town it does. And
People don't like when you mess up geography.
they don't like it.
We'll
So
let you know.
so for the second one, I tried to be a little bit more accurate about the geography of Keokuk. And again, it's sort of it's an unnamed town, but the geography is much more accurate. And I think the streets are probably more accurate for those who care. That said, do any of you use resources? Do you use historical resources to go back to, refer to, or is that not as important? Is memory more important in creating the place for you, Larry?
Memory is more important, but sure, I do some, yeah, absolutely, I do some research, but I don't do it in advance of working on a novel, mostly because I don't know what it is that I'm going to need. And if you feel as though you have to know everything about a place and time before you begin writing, you'll never start writing. So I sort of do it on an ad hoc basis. I see an awful lot of commentary about writers and computers and writers who say, oh, you must disconnect from the internet. You cannot have that connection while you're writing. I like it a lot. So if I'm writing about a 1955 Ford or something like that, within seconds I can come up with images of that Ford and proceed rather than having to stop and, I don't know, how did they used to do it? Go to museums, go to libraries or something. Microfilm, oh my God, yeah. But yes, I do research, but on an as-needed basis.
And are you, slavish is overstating it, but do you try to stick to the facts, or do you sort of bend the facts based upon where the story's taking you?
No, I feel as though I'm sticking to the facts, but they're my facts.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like your fictional town. I mean, so I made up a Bent Rock, Montana, and so now I feel as though I have to be true to Bent Rock, Montana. Of course, Bent Rock doesn't exist anyplace but in my imagination. But I do feel as though I have to be true to that.
And Lili, how do you? You're obviously from the place that you write about, or in the place that you write about. But are you doing research as well for any aspect of your writing?
Well, only for, thank you. Only for the one in Panama, we had the Panama Railroad, which we saw a lot of traffic from the cowboys who were rushing towards San Francisco for the gold rush, and many stayed here. There was one particular incident in Panama. It's called the watermelon slice incident, and it went down in history like that. American cowboys in transit on the way to San Francisco. They stopped there. They got fruit. They never paid for it. Major riot. They had to go in. U.S. Marshals, you name it. So we have this cowboy story happening in Banana Republic. So that is one episode that I'm researching a little bit more. Yes, we have our relationship with the U.S. is quite delicate. That we have a love and hate relationship. And so I'm researching that and see whether I can put these cowboys in Banana, surrounded by the plantain trees and everything, and see if that works. That's the only research I'm doing right now. I recently went to San Francisco. I couldn't dig up much, and the tracks, they left more stuff in Panama, more tracks of correspondence back home, and that's the only thing I'm researching. I wouldn't even try to take this story to San Francisco because not my turf, and it's told by the voice of a very unlikely Panameño. So I never venture into other lands. So that's the only thing I'm researching right now.
And other than looking at the hermit through binoculars, and your parents' memory and your personal memory, do you do any research on
setting?
Yeah.
I do. I actually do. I agree with Larry that once the scaffolding of a story is in place, it's a much better time to sort of start to tinker with that kind of thing and lose myself in the rabbit hole of the internet once I have something on the page. In Stiltsville, I researched. I do a lot of answering questions that I have for myself in my novels. And when I was in high school, the Gainesville murders happened. I don't know if they made the news out here, but it was a really big deal in Miami, mostly because, UF is kind of like UIowa. People just, Miami high schools just dump out into them. I knew tons of people there, and I remember worrying for people I knew and their safety, but also thinking, what would it be like to be a parent of a child who is in Gainesville right now? Because that's just terrifying. He was on, there were 5 bodies in 4 days or something, he just kept going. So I remembered that that's a question that I wanted to answer. And then the research of that time was, completely different from experiencing that time in 1992, looking back. And the other little, I researched a few historical events in Miami during the times of my books, but the other one that just sticks in my mind is that I researched Hurricane Andrew, which is in both my books, and which I lived through and should remember everything about, but I had to research evacuation patterns for hospitals. And so, you just get a lot of logistics, like what happened, which hospitals, where did they go, what was it like, how did they move people, how many people fit in an ambulance, stuff like that. But I also came across this picture of the chief of the Mercy Hospital, Mercy's on the water, so it was evacuated. And he had, and I put this immediately into my book, and I hope that he doesn't mind, but he had actually kind of railed against their evacuation policy as chief, because he said it was inefficient or whatever, and then he had to just eat his words. And there's this picture of him standing in, I think, what had been an OR in shin deep water with a dead stingray at his feet and a huge hole through the back of the wall. And he was like, yeah, evacuating was a pretty good idea. So of course, that kind of research, I experienced Hurricane Andrew, but I did not see that at the time. It's a wonderful tidbit to go back into that scaffolding.
And how much of that entered into the writing then?
Everything I just said went directly. You don't have to read my book now. No, that's the thing. If you have the scaffolding of the story in place and you use research as a way to revise, I think you can do a much more efficient job of it than if you research first. And that is one of the many reasons why my first book took 10 years to write and my second book took 10 months.
I think I'm actually the opposite. I think that once I have the scaffolding in place, I get bogged down in the research.
really?
And it completely derails me in lots of ways. The second book, as I said, takes place in Keokuk, and I don't know how many of you have visited there, but there are actually 2 bridges that span the river, and one is the unused bridge. It is basically a railroad bridge and sort of looks like the carcass of a bridge. It's all wrought iron scaffolding, and then there's the new bridge. And I knew I wanted to have those bridges, and they're central to the book, and I completely just got consumed with researching how the bridges were constructed, when they were constructed, who constructed them, when they shut down, and probably 1% of all that research entered into the book. And I kept thinking, this is so fascinating, I want to use all of this, and then ended up dismissing much of it because it had nothing.
Drove over the bridge.
They drove over the bridge, exactly. They used to use the bridge, they don't use the bridge anymore, but you don't really need to know much more than that. And these kids in the book keep returning to these bridges, and they don't really care who built them and when they shut down and why they're still there. And you know, the only thing that I did change, I think that it ended up being that the current bridge was too low for my purposes. This boy in the story keeps jumping from the bridge, and it's much too low. So I had to raise the bridge, which is like, you know, a non-factual thing. But
And then you got emails?
and then I got emails. And well, actually, one of the emails I got was somebody who said, you know, you didn't describe the Burlington bridges accurately. And again, there's an unnamed town. That's like, well, that's because you have to go downriver just a little bit for the right bridges.
Yeah, but don't you think too, though, that sometimes you need to know some things for yourself? You said you answer questions for yourself. In order to write the sentence, they drove over the bridge.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you know, I'm also one of those people that I think the internet is a great tool for me to delay writing, and it's great excuse to not do the work at hand, which is I have to find out all about these bridges. And then another component, again, in Keokuk, and this is a central place in the book, is down by the river. Those 2 bridges, there's a statue, and then there's the George Verity, which is an old paddle boat that's abandoned on the banks of the river, and that floods all the time. So in fact, it flooded this spring, so the boat actually is in the water for a couple weeks out of the year. And so then, of course, all I needed was that boat to be flooded, but I researched when the Verity was in the water, who built the Verity, and the only thing out of that I used was that it was once called the Thorpe back in the day. And so I changed the name from the Verity to the Thorpe in the book. But it was like, you know, a couple weeks of research on this boat to come up with a fictional name for the boat.
What do you do with the surplus information? Do you store this in your mind?
Yeah,
It's in the cabinet in
it
my
gets,
mind.
exactly. It's stored there, and I keep thinking, this is going to be so important someday.
I hear you. Yep. I can see myself doing the same thing. No. Do you even with the surplus information? Can you build other works with it?
God, I hope so.
Good for you. I can't. I just boop.
Yeah.
I just trash it. Just put it through the shadow. What else? I wanted to ask you something. What about recreating emotion in those particular landscapes? How do you tackle that for your works?
Yeah, but for me, I think both books deal with high school kids, so 16, 17-year-olds, and obviously the bulk of my emotions were in that place at that time, so I can draw upon that and hope that that becomes universal for kids today. They're contemporary novels, and hope that kids are still having the same emotions in the same places.
The creative landscape will affect those emotions because
Yes.
you have yours, but in a
Yes.
different landscape. How
Right.
do you mold that to the new one, or how does it affect the emotions of the characters that you're portraying in this particular new landscape?
Yeah, and that is something that I think I strive for, and look at character first and landscape second instead of the other way around.
Okay.
But look at how those 2 things rub against each other, and sort of what sparks fly off from that.
Okay.
What? Susanna?
Emotional landscape?
Yeah, I can't look that up on the internet. Yeah. I sort of wish you could. Yeah, like you, Gregory, I try to have some sense of, sometimes it's to remember how I might have felt in a place. You know, when in the thousands and thousands of panels on a writer's sense of place that take place all over the country every year, it's almost always the writer's sense of place, but connected to that, or maybe behind that, is the character's sense of place. People feel something about where they are, and I try to keep that in mind, and also to try to keep in mind that sometimes your characters feel about a place something that you don't feel about a place. So, for example, I have some fiction that is set sort of in the West. We all know about the myths of the American West, and we don't subscribe to them. But some of the people who live in those places do. And so I try to keep that in mind as I'm writing. And for me, that's what emotional landscape frequently means.
Yeah, I think that, you know, to build upon that, like oftentimes I think in the writing, the characters react to the place much differently than I did or would. And those are sort of exciting moments in the writing where, you know, you do feel as if the characters are leading you into something. And, you know, in some respects, I think that it helps me reconnect to where I grew up. What I'm writing about is that these characters are seeing this place that I left in a different way than I did at the time and do now. Anything to add to that?
No, I don't know that I have anything to add. I would just say that, you know, just with the whole answering questions for myself in fiction, and, you know, people always talk about writing as being like Stanislavski-esque, you know, just actually really putting yourself into the shoes of the person who is experiencing something that you might, I mean, in my case, something that I fear I might experience, or something that I feel I've dodged in my life. My characters are much less fortunate than I am. Sorry, people, but they are. And I think that seeing Miami through the eyes of a person who is either left, returning, not raised there, I like to sort of look at my hometown as if it weren't my hometown. And think of it that way, and think of it as like filtered through the lens of a person who's experiencing something that gives me anxiety. And I think it sort of charges the setting in a way that it's not really that charged if you're really just walking down the street.
And you know, to that point, I think all of us are drawn to the places we write about through a very personal connection. What if, let's say, you couldn't write about Miami, that you had to write your stories in another place? Could you even do that? And how would you go about doing that if someone gave you that sort of hypothetical?
I think that hypothetical is looming. I really do, because people keep saying, how many, you know, like I said, how many South Florida novels are you going to write? So I get the feeling from that question that I'm not supposed to write any more South Florida novels. And I think about it a lot. I do think, you know, as a writer, as ethnographer, is the only way that I can continue to be. So being kind of a Midwestern transplant, or a Miamian transplant in the Midwest, I could write about that if I developed that eye more, but it would take a while. I mean, you get a lot of accusation as a writer that your work is autobiographical, and it's almost never autobiographical. But setting is often autobiographical, actually. I mean, that is the thing that is truest. And I don't know that I want my work to divorce itself from that.
And Larry, what if it wasn't Montana 1948, but Miami 1948?
I like the planet Zevon or something.
Planet Zevon, yeah. Well, I'd Google it. Yeah. You know, I guess you look for some sort of point of entry and some correspondence between your own life and experiences and the planet Zivan? Zivan, yeah. How could I forget that? And the Zivanites who live there. So I suppose this teenage kid living on the planet Zivan who's got these sort of thwarted desires and he wants a certain direction in his life, and I'm well on my way to this novel about life on the planet Zivan. Some point of correspondence, some way that I can find some way to enter another life using my own. I mean, I do not write autobiographical fiction, and yet I do feel as though I make use of myself in creating characters.
So do you think Zivan then would sort of at some point take on the characteristics of North Dakota, Montana?
Yeah. The winters are brutal on Zivan. Yeah, absolutely.
You lose history.
Yeah.
You lose all of that backstory that's imbued into a real place. I mean, of course, you can write about whatever you want, but if your writing relies on some sense of like generational past, then you lose that element of it.
Yeah, and I know your new novel, you talked about in your reading that it was based upon not your grandparents per se, but sort of memories of them and a very fictionalized version of them, which sort of gets back to the original thing of sort of the past and place. But obviously, those are both very personal experiences that are then taken in a non-autobiographical direction.
Sure, and because I write fiction, my way of trying to know something about people and places is through the imagination. Another kind of person, another kind of writer might write history or a sociological study or some hybrid of those. But again, because I write fiction, I try to find my way in through the imagination.
And those are more sort of guideposts than anything for you then? As
Exactly,
you're writing?
yeah, sure.
And Lili, how about yourself in terms of?
In terms of?
In terms of, your personal experiences and how that really affects the location and setting.
Yeah, of course. I am I'm the compounded history of my past, the past of my parents, the past of grandparents, and so forth. Unlike other nations in the world, I don't know. Here, I see that the elderly are dispatched somewhere far away. I mean, you always live far away from your elders. And in Panama, we have them right next to us. So there is that source of information to rebuild the past. So of course I cannot divorce that from what I do. It would be removing also that historical past, that emotional past that can be recreated. We have our elders available there, and I talk to a lot of old folks to give me a sense of what it was like to live with the unaltered landscape. I do a lot of interviews with them, or just, shoot the shit. We just sit down and have coffee, and they tell me, oh, do you know my friend Jacinto? He's still alive. He was there for the one of the landslides when they were building the canal. He's still around. You want to talk to him? I said, yeah, I would love to have coffee. And go over there. So I can never separate my place, my setting from myself. That's it. It's as simple as that.
I think that we'd now like to open it up for questions, if any of you guys have any questions for any of the panel members. And certainly want to thank Larry and Susanna and Lili for joining us.
I sense a kind of dichotomy between the people of the place and the place itself, as though you're all standing back from the people. Larry talked about how he enters some of his characters. What if you're writing about people who are certainly not admirable? Do you then make judgments about that, or do you withhold that? how much do you identify with the characters of the place, I guess is part of what I'm asking. And how do you separate place from people?
Well, none of the characters that I write about are admirable, I don't think, so. I try not to be judgmental and, really try to see the world through them. And I think that does get back to place. And it's probably, in some respects why I'm drawn back to where I came from, Keokuk, which is unique, I think, even in terms of Iowa. We sort of felt disconnected from Iowa. It's not an agricultural city. And most of our news came from Missouri, Illinois. So we sort of felt like outsiders, even within our own state. And I think that helps me sort of at least get to those characters that are, one, outside of me a little bit, but outside of even the state, their community. And I think that helps me quite a bit sort of get that character connection to place, if that answers your question at all.
In the particular case, I try to birth my characters and quietly walk away. I let them be. But they do come with a basic package. I call this the Panama Package. We all have, it's a very small land. It's almost like an island. It's tiny. So we all come with this basic chunk of information. It's your basic pack. So all the characters get the basic pack. I don't know if you do role-playing. Very geek of me, I know. But, if you do role-playing, you basically start with, so everybody gets the basic, then we get the particulars. Okay, you grew up in Chorrillo, you get this. You get this. You grew up in Paitilla, which is a ritzy part of town, you get this. And so by the time I'm done giving them all their packs, they turn out quite different, but there's always that layer that is common. So that's the only way. I try to be fair in the giving of things. And I'm not even, it's not something indiscriminate. How do I say this in English? This is not something indiscriminate at all. It's just how it is home. And then I tweak it a little bit. I try to be as fair to my characters as possible and not judge them. So they can appeal to the reader in their very honest, Panamanian facade, and the reader can then bring out the shovel and start digging. That's it.
I think sometimes the choices that characters make are, evil is a little strong, but the reasons that they make those choices are not. So I think that's for me, a draft problem. So in the first draft, they might be making some bad choices that are not particularly sympathetic, but in my work, the revision has to concentrate on how to bring that compassion that I would bring to a person in the world. You don't go around just saying, well, you do like when you're driving, like we all hate everybody when we're driving, but we don't do that in real life, right? We understand that that choice, it's not personal. Whatever choice that you made that offends me, it's not personal. It comes from having, something has happened. And to not give your character that background is to be so miserly and unkind. But for me, it definitely is like a second draft, third draft thing.
I guess I feel the way I feel in life, that people, maybe especially people who are less than admirable, nevertheless feel as though they have their reasons. I try to give them their due. They feel as though they're justified in behaving as they do, just as those of us who are quite admirable do. Yeah.
You talked about place in terms of the novel. Are you affected by, and sometimes you're away from the place you're writing about, but are you strongly affected by place when you are writing, the place in which you actually sit to write? So it's a little different question about what you create versus the conditions, the environment in which you are able to create it. For example, Leo Tolstoy was very much affected. He sort of had to be at his estate to feel, right. And
I have to be at my estate.
Okay, well.
if you don't have an estate, where are you? I mean, so I guess what I'm asking is, do you have to be actually in a geographical location, or is it enough to be in some kind of room, some kind of setting that could be anywhere? You know, you can, okay, as long as I have this set of conditions around me, I feel like I can write.
I actually have to have a place. That place changes periodically, and I don't know why. Now it's going to be Susanna's estate is going to be the place I have to be. But yeah, I definitely find a location, and I think, you know, that's changed because of what I write on. You know, now with a laptop, you're mobile, and, or, you know, place can change, I guess. But it's certainly a room in the house, a place in the house, and I tend to be productive in that place for a while, and then, you know, maybe it dries up and I have to find a different place.
Yeah, so we do. I live near the ocean. All of us live near the ocean. So I live in a ghetto, and it's a bad part of town, but lovely, I have an ocean view. Blue, bright ocean. So now I'm in Iowa. Woohoo! So what I do is I open the window and I open the door of my hotel room and create a draft. So as long as I have that draft coming in, I'm good to go. And in my mind, I put little things around me that kind of remind me of that feeling. I gotta have that. And when it dries up, like you, I have to take it somewhere else. I just haven't found the next venue here. I reckon anywhere's fine to write, to take notes, but the light and breeze. Almost sea breeze. No, thank goodness. They're pulling me out of here soon, so thank goodness. They're taking me to New Jersey. Yay! Can you see the excitement? Yeah. Yeah, but it'll be cold. But I'll manage. I'll figure it out.
And, historically, there's lots of interesting anecdotes about writers and their place. You know, John Cheever, I think, famously would put on a suit and tie, take the elevator down to the basement of his building, strip down to his underwear, and write. And he was called the Hermit, I think. Larry, you want to comment on?
I can write it. I can write anywhere.
I can too, as long as I have headphones. Just block out the noise of screaming children and babysitters pulling out their hair. I don't need to hear any of that.
Do you listen to music while you talk?
You know, I do. I listen to music. One thing I've done is I've painted my home office for each of my novels. They have, like, to me, they have different colors. That sounds very HGTV, but otherwise they're not, you know, it's not a really exciting little bedroom in my home. But for each of my novels also, I had kind of a playlist that developed, you know, music that was just energizing to me in a particular way or urgent to me in a particular way. But I've also recently, I'm not working with a playlist right now, and I've discovered focusatwill.com, which is you could just like hear my husband rolling his eyes at this, but it's like music that is meant to distract the piece of your brain that you want distracted while you're focusing. So it's not, it doesn't pull your attention, but it just is there, and that's kind of what my playlists always end up doing anyway, so I've been using that. Excuse me? No, well, yeah, it's sort of music-y. Yeah. There's a music component. I'm not a snob. Yeah, I like it.
So this will come as no surprise. So my first novel actually had 3 playlists in them, and I thought I could bang out a playlist in 20 minutes, and I probably spent 3 months creating the playlist. Just like the more I listened to them, the more CDs, albums I would break out, and then of course I wanted every song to mean something, and then the whole CD to mean something. And they're actually playlists that are created by this character, and she sends these CDs to this love interest of hers, and she sends them in interesting ways. So the first one is frozen in a block of ice, so then I had to figure out how do you actually freeze a CD in a block of ice, and you know, it was all research. Did you still have a question?
It doesn't seem to be working, so
Okay. As to setting, a lot of times you'll have an impression of a place and the locals might find it disparaging. Do you try to dilute that and balance it out and say, yes, this is the part I'm talking about, all this is pretty over here as well? Or do you just hold to your guns and say, this was my impression. That's what I'm talking about.
How many books do you want to sell? I'm just kidding. I say you hold your guns, your character's guns.
I would agree
Yeah,
too.
I think-
Stick to your guns.
Yeah.
Always. It's gonna boil to that, it's art. I'm finding these days that you can put that art label on anything and get away with murder. So you stick to your guns, you say, this is it, this is how I see it, this is how it goes, pa'l carajo, you know, don't matter.
Perfect. Thank you all for coming.